Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues. This week we've witnessed a paradigm shift in India's military and foreign policy. We've also seen a lot of sound and fury, which I'm ignoring on tonight's dialogue because this is about a conversation for new perspectives, new ideas on the way ahead. That's why joining me tonight are some of India's best strategic thinkers, also some new young voices with fresh ideas. I'm joined by Ambassador Satish Chandra. He's the former Deputy National Security Advisor in the Vajpayee government, also the Dean for National Security and Strategic Studies at the Vivekanand Foundation. Also with me is Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, also former Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. And two young new voices, Dhruv Jaishankar, Fellow of Foreign Policy at Brookings India, also Constantino Xavier, Associate at Carnegie India, specializing in India's security, strategy and foreign policy, and always an interesting cultural voice, the former Rajya Sabha MP and well-known Bollywood lyricist, Javed Akhtar. Thank you all very much for being on the show this evening. Ambassador Chandra, what do you think has been the major goal achieved with last week's military action? What has been the shift you've seen? You've talked about India's earlier policy of engagement and appeasement. What is different now?
No, clearly I think, as you said, this is a defining moment, and I think we shouldn't look at the surgical strikes as a basic thing which has made the change. I think it's much more than that. It is a series of actions which the government has taken, of which this is just one. And I think that's the way to go about handling it. And when I say series of things, I talk about the campaign to try and isolate Pakistan. I talk about the statements made by the Prime Minister on a relook at the Indus Waters Treaty and at MFN. Also, the references he made to the human rights violations by Pakistan in various parts of Pakistan, as well as in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan and so on. So it's a composite, and I think this marks a distinct shift from anything that we have seen, because I do feel that, and I'm a part of this, that our Pakistan policy has failed, and I dealt with Pakistan for several years, that we have always either tried to accommodate Pakistan or appease it, depending on who was dealing with things. And my own view, which I think increasingly some people are starting to accept, is that you need to make a change in policy, that you need to impose costs on Pakistan for the export of terror. So that is the basic thought. But why this change? There is another reason. I'll comment to that later.
In fact, Saran, that's an interesting point, that actually when you look at it as a defining moment, it is also an acceptance in a way that what we've been doing for over 60 years hasn't worked. We needed something completely different. It's not really about a same old Pakistan or a different Pakistan. It's about a new India, which is now defining what happens with Pakistan. Do you agree with that view?
I would like to limit that to the issue of cross-border terrorism, because in other respects, frankly, where you see India today and where you see Pakistan today, certainly nobody in India would like to be where Pakistan is today. So in that sense, I think India has taken a very different trajectory, and Pakistan has taken a trajectory which has turned out to be a very negative trajectory. But yes, I think it is true that as far as cross-border terrorism is concerned, particularly with the emergence of both countries as nuclear weapon states, a new situation had arisen where it was perhaps an inhibition on our side that, in terms of any response to that, are we going to get into an escalatory kind of situation? Now, it is very important that no political leader should be faced with a binary choice. That is, if something like, say, Mumbai happens, either you do nothing, make a lot of noise, say, I will not talk to you anymore, or you have a military response to that with the risk of escalation. What has changed, I think, is India having found space between these two extremes, not only just in terms of the military strike, but as Ambassador Satish Chandra said, as part and parcel of a complex of different, in a toolkit. You have now several tools that you can utilize in order to influence the strategic calculus in Islamabad. So, in a sense, you have established a new normal. Now, having established a new normal, I think we should not make it abnormal by reacting each time something happens. I think the message has gone through to those who need to have that message, and if you see recent reports, it would appear that the sense of isolation, the sense that the old policies with respect to India are not really working, are not finding resonance in the international community. I think this is to our advantage. Let us not lose that advantage by making too much sound and fury about this.
Yeah, exactly, about the bluster. I want to bring in Javed Akhtar on perhaps some what you said about the new normal, and the point you made also about the old Pakistan policy is now actually history in a way. Javed Saab, when you're looking at what's happening as a citizen of India, as somebody who studied culture, and interestingly, of course, Bollywood has always either romanticized the Indo-Pak equation, either Pakistan is the villain, or maybe like a border kind of movie which you were associated with, or it's like Bajrangi Bhaijaan. So Bollywood also goes between two extremes, something like our politicians do about Pakistan. What do you see as the change now again? I mean, we're living in times where dialogue is almost a bad word when it comes to about Pakistan, but what do you see as the new normal with India-Pakistan?
Well, as a matter of fact, I suppose you cannot be indifferent towards your neighbors, whether you dislike them or you like them. You have to react, and that to a great extent depends on their attitude. I won't say that this is a new India. I'll say that India had read its data. We have been tolerating, we have been trying to reason out things, but obviously one had to draw a line somewhere. I'm very happy. As a matter of fact, I must tell you that before this happened, exactly 10 days before that, I tweeted that our forces have to destroy terrorist camps, and if they are across the border, so be it. And so many of my friends sent me messages that your wish is fulfilled by Indian Army. But it was overdue. And let them say anything, let anybody say anything, but I quite agree that the message has been conveyed. They cannot go scot-free every time. And it was surgical, it should remain surgical. What we had to do, we have done. Again, if something of this sort will happen and of this magnitude will happen, like in Uri, it will be done again. That should be clear to them. And as far as the policy is concerned, yes, it has become a little more proactive. I suppose 5 years back we did not talk about Balochistan. Today we are. But somehow, sometimes we have to pay them in their own coins. So it was inevitable. It was inevitable, and I think India has taken enough.
Mr. Jaishankar, Mr. Xavier, let me ask you first, Mr. Jaishankar. It's an exciting time to be a young foreign policy analyst, because in a way, we talked about this being the new normal. There's so many other interesting new equations emerging, whether it's on SARC, the complete isolation of Pakistan. Countries which had not spoken out so strongly for India are doing this now. Is it a confluence of interesting circumstances? Globally, the tolerance level for terrorism is going down. Is it also about India's emerging strength as compared to Pakistan, which is on a downward trajectory? And in that sense, do you think that they were all coincided, or was part of perhaps much more complex planning to make sure that there is a kind of pincer approach really in dealing with Pakistan, whether it's economically, militarily, and diplomatically?
Well, in some ways, if one were to look at this as a contemporary historian, there are many reasons, that one can point to developments taking place that at the individual level, at the bureaucratic level, at the political level, but also at the structural level. And I think we're seeing both at play. I mean, it's an interesting counterfactual. If a different government was in place, would it have done exactly the same thing? But I think the structural factors shouldn't be underestimated. The Indian economy, of course, is doing much better than almost any other major economy in the world. It's growing very well, very fast. India's been making steady strides in its diplomatic relations with many different parts of the world. I'd say three kinds of relationships in this particular context are very important. One is the US, where we're seeing a steady shift in US rhetoric towards India-Pakistan crises and tensions, slowly in some ways backing or at least more in line with what India would desire. Of course, the US still has great equities with Pakistan, and I think those can't be ignored, but we have seen a steady move in that direction. The second, and I think for this we have to give Prime Minister Modi considerable credit, is the Gulf Arab states, where he has made extraordinary efforts to reach out to them in the last 2 years.
And the UAE Crown Prince as Republic Day chief guest at this
exactly.
time.
Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and we saw after the Uri attacks that they unequivocally condemned those attacks, and again I think this is quite a change. The third is actually in the region, as you mentioned. I think Afghanistan is one of them. We had President Ghani, who previously had tried to broker a new normal with Pakistan, and I think that is now in tatters. But also you can see how the investment in India's relations with other neighbors, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, even Nepal, have started to pay off in this respect. So, if you look at these relationships, I think you see an increasingly isolated Pakistan. On the other hand, I think we're seeing China playing a more active role defending Pakistan, sometimes putting its own neck out there to its own embarrassment, and to a lesser degree I think Russia is a cause for concern, and I think the reported exercises between Russia and Pakistan I think are something we should be watching quite carefully.
No, in fact we will discuss China separately because that is really one focus, but Mr. Xavier, come in on that. When you look at the new redefinements in the neighborhood globally for India as well, the one variable that we can't really look at is the Pakistan response at all in this. So over the last week, when you've seen the Pakistan response, reports coming out now of the fact that perhaps the political establishment, that both the Prime Minister and his brother were very strong with the ISI and the military on how they cannot defend to the world anymore how terrorists are openly walking around in Pakistan. How much do you think what happens in Pakistan is going to be a complete unguessable variable that we don't know how it's going to play out?
I mean, on this specific issue, I think the most interesting development is this larger strategic package, if you want, beyond just the strikes, which Ambassador Satish Chandra mentioned, have really, in some ways, I think, possibly, according to the reports today, changed the dynamics domestically in Pakistan. And that's, in a sense, the largest strategic possible effect which India can desire, that the civil-military imbalance, if you want, in Pakistan may suffer from this and may create some resentment and discontent within the civilian establishment, the Prime Minister. But let me just focus on the previous issue, which I think there's two very interesting stories here. One is, for years and decades, India has suffered and bled at the hands of terror from Pakistan. And that has, often been ignored by Western countries. I remember 10 years ago, I was here in Delhi, the European Union refused to condemn simple attacks which were obviously emanating from Pakistan, and instead would send its ambassadors to Kashmir for the Indian Kashmir, to human rights inspections and sort of speak that language and see what India is doing there. That was the business of Western countries on Kashmir and India, Pakistan. That has changed fundamentally. These days, the US and the European Union are not shying away from condemning these terror attacks.
The Parliament issued a statement.
Establishing a link with Pakistan, which is quite clear, even if implicit. But the other story, which is also quite interesting, I think is India's confidence to sort of, instead of just assuming it will be understood and all countries will understand its reaction, actually reaching out to these various countries, playing the diplomatic game, calling over close to 30 envoys here in New Delhi for a briefing on the next day after the attacks, cultivating them and explaining what the reasoning was behind this attack and why this is an important step.
Ambassador Chandra, the China factor, if we can bring it in, because really in that sense it is still the only major country which is reaching out to Pakistan in terms of its global isolation, and the fact that in a way it's something like how the US ignored China's human rights record because they needed China for business. India may be moving into that position much more, but the fact of China investment in POK, China needs to guard its own investments. How will that play out in the Pakistan variable, and how would you see the Pakistan reaction now, especially with this whole civil-military tension perhaps?
On the China thing, I think the relationship really started to build up from around 1964 onwards, and you can see it in terms of, if you look at CIPRI figures, Chinese military assistance, I think in 63 or 64 was $2 million. Within 2 years it became $166 million, and today, if you look till 2015 figures, the biggest donor, the country to whom the largest amount of Chinese military assistance has gone is to Pakistan, and it stands at over $13 billion as against North Korea, which is next at $5 billion. So the military factor was always there, and as Andrew Small has very vividly indicated in his book, if the military factor was critical and very important, the nuclear factor within the military factor was even more important, the bomb and so on. But I think there has again been a defining moment. We are today talking of defining moments in the Sino-Pakistan relationship, and that is CPEC. Because what China has felt apparently, and here I would defer to Shyam because he is the acknowledged expert amongst a lot of us on China issues, yes. But, and me too, the defining moment is this, because with CPEC, China has decided that Pakistan is its long-term ally apart from all-weather friend and so on and so forth. And China has a need for Pakistan also to look for achieving its greater global ambitions. And CPEC is just not a communication type of thing. It is also the amount of investment in economic infrastructure in Pakistan, particularly the power sector, in which the bulk of the money will be going. That is getting 46 billion. But one thing I wanted to add, and since this debate is about that, something which is dearer to me, that is Pakistan. And you had mentioned that. I think when we look at how Pakistan will react and civil and military relations, on these two issues I'd like to make two quick points. Number one, as far as India is concerned, no one can change Pakistan's views on it. And in fact, I think Pakistan is committed to somehow, anyhow, damaging India. I mean, these friends in Pakistan, when one was there, told one as much, very, very openly. So that is, I think, a factor which we have to look at in terms of thinking out our own strategy. And that's why when I said imposing costs, what I meant was not just a military strike. It's a very long drawn out policy. It will have to be over 5 or 10 years unless Pakistan changes. Now that's the second point. What is the likelihood of Pakistan changing? I think very low possibility. And the military is going to continue to call the shots. It's the most powerful element there. And they have vested interests. You read any books on Pakistan, they are in all facets of Pakistan, political and economic.
But the fact, and in fact, the Ambassador Sharon, of course, the China expert, not just in this room, but in many areas elsewhere as well. But when you look, ex-defense minister once said, forget Pakistan, China is enemy number one. So when we look at the China-Pakistan relationship, the impact on perhaps India's new policy looking ahead, what do you think how is that actually going to play out in this whole equation?
Two things. One is that there is no doubt that China-Pakistan relations have acquired a dimension which goes beyond using Pakistan merely as a proxy against India. So Pakistan is not only a long-term ally against India, but it has acquired a important position with respect to what Ambassador Satish Chandra said, China's regional strategy as well as its global strategy. Because the One Belt, One Road initiative is not just an economic initiative. It is an overall strategic initiative which will roll out over a number of years, because these are infrastructure projects. So I think one of the reasons why Pakistan has perhaps felt emboldened in the last couple of years is precisely because it believes that it has a stronger shield in a more powerful China.
So how does India tackle the China issue? Because whether it's the NSG, whether it's Masood Azhar and now the Brahmaputra, as soon as India mentioned Indus Water Treaty, we heard, though of course the dam building was happening much earlier, but interesting news about a fresh dam coming up kind of leaked at that time.
Two things. One is there is no escape from building up our own capabilities, because ultimately what will make a difference is whether or not India, like today, it is the fastest growing economy in the world. Unfortunately, over the last several years, the gap between the economic and military capabilities of the two countries has diverged in favor of China. We have to begin to shrink that gap between the two powers, because that is what will give you a degree of I would not say insulation, but at least the other side should have the view that if I do something, it is going to be a very risky affair. So that capability you must have, even if you don't have equivalent capability. In addition to that, of course, you do what we have been doing. That is, there are several other countries which are equally concerned about the unilateralist kind of approach that China has adopted in together with the rise in its capabilities. And if we are able to work together with them, that certainly acts as a constraint on China. And that is happening. That is happening. So one is what we can do in terms of internal balancing, and the other is what we do in terms of external balancing.
International diplomacy.
And keep up the engagement with China. I think that's very important because it's a relationship which is going to be one of the most important relationships for India. And if we can keep that engagement going even while we confront China on issues which are threatening to us, I think that is the best way in keeping the managing the relationship in a sense.
No, that is, of course, the art of war or the art of diplomacy, as it in so many ways extremely similar.
So it's very good to have the BRICS summit and have Xi Jinping come here.
Exactly. So, and Pakistan not part of that summit again, interestingly, so good for India. There's such a huge constituency here who are fans of a young Pakistani actor, Fawad Khan, the heartthrob here for many Indians, and the same way across the border. So many young Pakistanis who watch Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan and various other Hindi film stars. Is this a constituency you would want to see cultivated, whether it's Fawad Khan in India or whether it's Shah Rukh Khan or Salman Khan in Pakistan?
I mean, when we talk only about that, Sonia, when we talk only about that, we almost trivialize that topic. The fact is that we respect successful societies, all of us, everywhere in the world. In the history, successful societies have been respected and admired and emulated. India, in the eyes of an average Pakistani, is an extremely successful society. It is not only cinema. It is Indian society, it's industrialization, it's democracy, it's media, and so on and so forth. It's affluence, it's achievement in IT, everything, and cinema too. It's not only cinema. So when we talk only of cinema, as a matter of fact, we make it
too trivial. I'm just going to bring in Mr. Jaishankar again. As I said, as a young foreign policy analyst, we just had Ambassador Chandra say, well, in that sense, Pakistan is not going to change. It's in their DNA to be anti-India. Are you optimistic that there could be a change in the Indo-Pak relationship, that in a way that we've come to this stage, but things can only get better now? Or do you feel that now is just a time to be pragmatic, forget the romanticism? This is about dealing with hard brass tacks. And Ambassador Chandra said very thing. He said, I failed. I'm going to ask Ambassador Saran what he feels on his stint and whether he thinks that policy has failed. But what would you see?
I'm afraid I share some of the at least skepticism of Ambassador Satish Chandra. But I would, I think, give him and his colleagues and Ambassador Sham Saran maybe a little bit more credit than they give themselves. I think, in the last 17, 18 years since India and Pakistan went nuclear, India's had to deter Pakistan from various things, incursions, as in Kargil, attempting, fomenting insurgency in Kashmir, and so forth. So now India's actually been rather successful at doing that, not without some mistakes along the way. It's been a learning process, I think, for India. But India's been largely successful at deterring Pakistan to India's benefit. Compelling Pakistan to change its ways is a much more difficult task, and I think both articulated quite well that this is a long-term process. Now, I think you can see hints of how India hopes to achieve that in some of the speeches that have been made recently by Prime Minister Modi, by External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj, and even more recently by M.J. Akbar, the Minister of State for External Affairs. I think there are three broad messages that are being sent. One, I think Prime Minister Modi made a point in his speech in Kerala to distinguish between the Pakistani leadership and the Pakistani people. I think that's an important message going forward. Two, you saw External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj try to globalize the issue. She drew links that this is not just an India-Pakistan problem, that terrorism in Brussels and New York and Kabul and Dhaka can all be linked in various ways back to Pakistan. So this is a global problem, and MJ Akbar actually reinforced that point by saying how Pakistan was being difficult in allowing trade between Afghanistan and India. And so if it wants to be a responsible player, it has to change, and the rest of the world should actually try and push it towards that. And the third message is actually that Pakistan is a fragile, vulnerable state and should not be
pushed.
And should not be doing this if given the problems it has at home. And
Yes,
and I think the fact that Sushma Swaraj brought up Baluchistan again in her speech at the UN was trying to reinforce that point that Prime Minister Modi brought up in his Independence Day speech about a month earlier. So I think these are the broad messages that I think India is trying to send, both to Pakistan and to the international community. And we can only hope that this, coupled with diplomacy and some military action, can actually help, coerce Pakistan into changing what has been a long-standing policy on their part of supporting cross-border terrorism.